Morning, everybody. So this morning I want to kind of give a follow-on to a panel discussion we gave yesterday about closing the mobile conversion gap and using data to get more revenue out of our mobile visitors. So just to introduce myself, I'm Oliver Sosinsky. I've been using a Mac for about a week. I just learned how to do forced shutdown. I'm a senior solutions engineer at RedStage Worldwide. We're a full-service digital agency specializing in the B2B space and digital transformations. So first, I want to just give a little bit of background about the program that we have been working on, and where we're at, and what these tests mean. So when I say the mobile conversion gap, the mobile revenue gap, I think we're all pretty familiar with kind of the situation where, users are spending by far most of the time on browsing our sites from mobile devices, up to about 2/3 of the time. And despite that, we're only getting about 25% of our revenue from those mobile devices. So what we've been doing so far, since about the beginning of the year, is in conjunction with PayPal and High Conversion and a total of about 12 other agencies, we've been running some relatively simple tests so far on the mobile checkout portion of our merchant sites, making some changes and just looking at what the data tells us about what the users prefer. So far, there's over been 250 tests run across about 63 merchants and $10 million of revenue tracked. So we have a pretty good base of data there to draw from. Now, when I talk about these tests that we're running about 4 or 5 so far templated tests, and really we're making fairly simple changes that we're seeing have a relatively large impact in RPV in the mobile funnel. So this is one example. This is basically a test that the hypothesis here is that we reduce the data entry on the mobile checkout, then that will reduce friction and increase RPV. So that's kind of the hypothesis of this test. Now, when I talk about RPV, as we go through all of these tests, that's the metric that we're going to be using to define the success or failure of any one of these tests on any of the viewports that we're testing on. A lot of people traditionally focus on average order value and conversion rate and try to balance those two, because we know when we see an increase in AOV, sometimes conversion rate can go down and vice versa. And rather than trying to figure out what's the combined impact of those two metrics, we should just use RPV as a measure of performance on any area of our site. It's basically just visitors times conversion rate times average order value. So it's one metric that kind of takes into account both of those things. And we're basically looking at how much revenue are we getting from each visitor. That's really what we care about. So now I'd like to start getting into some of the actual testing methodology. For that test that I just showed you and the few others that we've been working on, the first step for all the traffic coming in is for our testing platform, High Conversion, to figure out what type of device each of these users are coming in on. And we do that using the Wurfel database of mobile devices. Basically, an API lookup is passed the user agent string, and then based on browser and screen size and a few other parameters, the Wurfel database will return a device type, and that'll be tablet, mobile, or desktop. And those 3 device types are what we have used throughout the test to both to tailor the testing experience in the first place, to control how much traffic we are sending to the control and to the test group by device. So, for example, desktop might be getting a bigger split of the experiment versus the control group, and I'll get into about why we do those splits in a little bit. But this is the basic method of how we determine what kind of device a user is on, so that we can figure out which devices prefer which experiments. Now, when we look at a test that's being run, in this case on the mini cart part of the test, part of the checkout funnel, we have to remember what segment of the visitors to the site we're trying to influence, and accordingly what the results mean when we see a lift or a drop in RPV from those visitors. So in this case, if we have a test that's being run on the mini cart, then as we go down the funnel, only the visitors that have made it far enough to have browsed the site, add a product to the cart, and then either look at the mini cart or the actual cart page, those are the only visitors that we're really running our experiment on, because they're the only ones that are going to see the control or the test experience. So although that's only about 4% in this example, we find that 4% is pretty easy to influence. They have already browsed our site. They've already added a product to the cart, so we already know that they're interested in checking out. So when we look at double-digit increases or decreases in the RPV for these tests, we're talking about increases or decreases to that segment of visitors checking out. So what we're trying to do there is increase that 0.4% and try to turn some of those 3% people who are abandoning the checkout into finishing their checkout. Now, once we have the audience and the devices defined, that's when we start running these different experiments on that page. So the zip code test I showed you a little earlier was one example. Some other tests we're running is either showing or hiding a lock icon on the checkout button, using mobile input, using numeric input type fields for numeric fields on mobile, just so that users aren't using an alphanumeric keyboard to enter their phone number. And really pretty small changes. There we go. Pretty small changes relative to what you normally think of as a checkout overhaul. What the high conversion platform then does is we'll run the different combinations of those experiments. So we could be running all of those tests simultaneously on a single merchant's checkout. The high conversion platform will decide which combinations to test, so that we're testing all of the different permutations of, experiment A and B, but not C, and so on. At all times, we're keeping a 10% baseline that's not going to see any experiment, and we're doing that so that we can have a basis of comparison for all the different experiences we're trying to test. What high conversion will then do is, based on the success or failure of a particular experiment on a particular device, the platform will begin to send more or less of the traffic, starting at 50%, to the experience that is performing well or badly. So if we have an experiment that is performing well on mobile and poorly on desktop, the platform will automatically start to increase the split of traffic going to the mobile devices for the experiment and do the opposite for desktop. So what it's kind of doing is adapting to the results as we go along and kind of taking a lot of the manual intervention out of there, so that as we gain confidence that an experiment is succeeding, we're going to start using it for more of our visitors and start gaining more revenue from that. Now, looking at what the results look like, what we're looking at here is the results of one of those earlier tests, the zip code autofill. And on this particular merchant, we saw pretty much positive results across the board, across all devices. I wish we could say that about all the tests and all the merchants, but really that was a pretty rare occurrence. In almost all cases, we saw tests that failed on some devices but not others, and succeed with some merchants but not others, even on devices that failed for others. So it was really kind of a surprising spread of the results. Something as simple as making it easier to enter your zip code and autofill the city and state. We would have thought that everybody would love that, but some audiences hated it, and in some cases we saw double-digit drops in the RPV because of it. So when we look at the confidence level, and we ask how much data is needed to get a result that we can believe in, that's going to really vary depending on how successful the experiment is to begin with. If we see a clear delineation between the control group and the test group, it's going to take less visitors than if we it's kind of a toss-up. At the same time, if we have a lot of visitors, of course, that's going to decrease the amount of time that we need to get a significant result. And what we're using here is the Evan Miller sample size to basically get statistical significance based on how many conversions we get, and how successful is the treatment versus the control. Just to show another example of what I mean about the widespread in results. This is a histogram across all of the visitors that saw that same treatment across one of the merchants. And we see that there's kind of especially in the case of AOV, it's kind of a they loved it or hate it kind of thing. And we did actually see that in RPV for a lot of the tests. And that really starts to make the point that some of these things, they may be best practices for 90% of the sites out there, but there were definitely some outliers where implementing a test that worked for some could, lose you a double-digit drop in your RPV and your checkout. Looking at this another way, this is actually the spread of all of the merchants we ran that test on. So that same zip code test that we were looking at earlier, you can see here that some of these merchants got good results across the board, like the one I showed you a little bit earlier. Some of them only got good results on one device, and the takeaway here is, overall this was a positive result. If we average out all the data, we could just easily say that, yeah, adding a zip code autofill has an average lift of whatever it is, about 3 or 4%, something pretty small. But if we're not taking the time to actually collect that data from our own users and figure out which experiments they prefer, and then only applying those to the devices that it worked on, we're really missing out on a lot of that money. We could be one of these merchants where it's failing on 2 of the devices, but if we looked at that this is a positive thing overall, and we just implement it, we might end up losing money overall. So where's this going from here? I think so far what we've done this year is we've put together a pretty good community that's working on this problem. It's too big of a problem for just one agency or 1 or 2 merchants to solve. So that's why we put together this community of agencies and 65 merchants, and put together this methodology to try some bigger changes in the checkout in the future. Like, let's look at what putting mobile wallets front and center does, and let's try to really reimagine what checking out on a mobile phone is. And there is a lot of opportunity for any other agencies out there, any merchants who want to improve the RPV in their checkout. You can go to mobileoptimized.org. You'll find results of all of the rest of these experiments. You'll go into a little bit more depth. You can see the spread across all of the agencies that worked on this project. And you will also be able to sign up and get involved, both as an agency or as a merchant. All right, that's all I have for you. So if you have any questions, we have a bit of time. Yes?
I think
Yeah, it's a good question, because we do see different behavior in the seasonal shopping segment versus the rest of the year. Things that can work most of the year might not work on the slightly different kind of shopper. So what we really suggest there is keeping, especially for experiments that have kind of an unsure result. For example, though, like when we see in the histogram that some prefer it and some don't, we basically want to keep that experiment running, but turn down the split of traffic that's going to the experiment treatment. So basically, we're always getting a little bit of data from from the experiment, the experience that is performing less well, so that we know if it starts to pick up, we at least are collecting that data, and then we can start shifting the traffic back to what's now working. I think for the most part that would depend on what the results of that experiment look like. If we see something that is drastically positive, we might not really worry about that so much when we run a promotion. I think that would be a case-by-case basis, and it would depend on how close the experiment that we are running is to the baseline, and how big of a change we're making on the site. Like if it's something to do with the banner, and then we're having a promotion, that would definitely be something that we would want to get some more data on. So I think it would vary case by case. Yes?
For the merchants that you work with, do those of them already have a testing platform? Is this one put on their site in addition to it, or do those of the merchants not already have a testing platform?
Most of the merchants we work with actually don't have a testing platform. It's been a little bit of an uphill battle to kind of convince everybody of the need to be collecting this data on their site. As a merchant, you can actually add the high conversion platform to your site and start collecting data and seeing where those opportunities are and how you're doing without necessarily signing up for a plan right away. And that can kind of show you, how is your site doing, how are the different sections of the funnel performing, and where are some opportunities to improve the performance. Yes? Mm-hmm.
Although you will see this customer is abandoned the shopping the car, but at home he still buys the product.
That's definitely the biggest kind of explanation for why that mobile gap exists. Is that users like to browse on their phone, but they feel more comfortable actually making a purchase when they're sitting at their computer. But we want to look at that as a problem and not as kind of the way things are. We want to look at that as why. Why do they not feel comfortable? Why do they feel like they have to go to their computer? Is it too inconvenient? Is it a pain to enter the credit card number on the phone? So that's pretty much the question that we're trying to answer. We don't want to be happy with that gap in conversion rate, because some of those customers that browsed on the mobile site and had every intention of going home and buying it on the desktop, a percentage of those are not going to make it, and they're either going to find it somewhere else or not make a purchase. So we really want to get them right there where they're on the phone. And to your first point, I think you're right that mobile visitors are concerned about security. And it's funny, one of the tests that we had that performed the best was simply placing an icon of a padlock on that checkout button and just making that little change. That actually had pretty much the most unanimous positive results out of most of these things that we tested. So just that little subtle security symbol had a double-digit impact in RPV in some cases.
Anyone else have a question? Okay, got some back here.
For your personal opinion, what do you consider a successful mobile e-commerce conversion rate, or does it vary with each industry?
It is going to vary a lot across different types of sites. Someone like, I don't know, I like browsing the Mercedes site and dreaming of the car that I would build and building it and adding it to the cart, and then I leave and I get on with my day. So, I mean, that's one example. But, there's some sites that lend themselves more to browsing, especially hobby sites. Those might have lower conversion rates while still being successful, whereas someone like Amazon, where everybody knows what they're coming there for and is going to find it, is going to have a much higher conversion rate. As just a general baseline, 3% is pretty standard. We'd want it to be up more around 5%. Right now we're seeing industry-wide mobile conversion rates of around 1%. And I think that we should consider that unacceptable. We should at least be wanting to see the mobile conversion rate close to where it is on desktop.